Of the People is a new platform matching local campaigns with supporters and donors from across the country. Sort of like a Yelp for local candidates. You can filter by policy and location, and you can support the next generation of leaders. Check it out at ofthepeople.us. One of the stories we've been talking about now, really for the last 5 years since the Trump era started, but even in particular in the context of the January 6th riots, which are sort of like the culmination of a peak of complete non-thinking, anti-intellectual, radical, violent extremism. The question we've been thinking about is sort of like, how far back does this go? When did this start to infect the American right wing? And there are people who wrongly believe either that Donald Trump created this extremism, and that's definitely not true, or that the extremism started in the last 5 to 10 years and Donald Trump merely coalesced it, which is like 5% closer to the truth, but still very much not accurate. And James Rosen wrote a really interesting piece in the Hartford Courant called Republican Embrace of Extremism Began Long Before Trump. And you can read about it. And in the piece, James Rosen actually goes back to talking about 1994 and Newt Gingrich as a congressman at the time, becoming Speaker of the House, and how that was sort of a seminal moment in the radicalization of the Republican Party. And I think to a great extent that's true, but the stage was actually set even before that and would go back, I would say, to the 1980s and Ronald Reagan. And you don't see the same. I mean, listen, there's no doubt that Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Trumpian radicalism, storm the Capitol and this type of stuff, that was not around in the 80s, and that was not even around in the mid 90s when Newt Gingrich took over. But it's a progression, and this is why I've been arguing that it's going to take realistically a decade, maybe decades. I don't know. I mean, maybe 8 to 10 years minimum to make a big dent in this, because it's been building for so long. And we've interviewed, like over the last 8 years, I've interviewed people on all aspects of this: conspiracism, anti-intellectualism, religious radicalization, cult-like mentality, educational issues that lead to people being susceptible to this stuff, lack of media literacy. All of these different things are sort of charted parallel to the political story that has taken over on the American right. And if you really want to, you could go back to the civil rights era. You could actually go back to late 50s, 60s, civil rights era, and Roe v. Wade era, where I don't know. It's almost like when you get to 60 years, it starts to become harder to tell the story in discrete steps. But you could even say it started then, but certainly in the 80s with Reaganomics and the start of the spread of, in the more academic side, supply side economics, but the way that infected many on the right with these sort of faux libertarian ideas that become very authoritarian when the outcomes are not what they want. Stories about welfare queens, free riders on insurance, social welfare and insurance plans, and this type of thing in the 80s. That primed the pump for Newt Gingrich to come in 1994 and go to the next level. And Newt Gingrich in 94 certainly starts to make the Republican Party look more like the radicalism we see now. This led to the impeachment of Bill Clinton and very similar sort of persecution type radicalism from the right. This then combined with continued anti-intellectualism to give us George W. Bush. And remember that the non-thinking right of today blows the non-thinking right of the Bush era out of the water. But Bush was really the guy that started this, this guy's kind of dim sort of stuff, where we said, a lot of these people really aren't thinking, and they are being manipulated by religious ideology. They're being manipulated by misunderstandings about not only cultural, but also economic issues. The idea of education as left-wing indoctrination started to grow. Then you get Obama. And Obama, as the first black president, a half-black man, started to take the anti-intellectualism and the radicalism and the misunderstanding of economics and the lack of media literacy and coalesce it with racism that still then was sort of beneath the surface, although it was coming out. The number of death threats against Barack Obama, birtherism, etc. So by then it was really starting to bubble up and look like the modern thing. And then comes Trump and think back at this point, right? We go back to Roe v. Wade and the start of radicalization of the more religious right. You go to the civil rights era and you start with the radicalization of the more overtly racist. You get to the 80s and you add unthinking Reaganomics. And then Gingrich comes in 94 and gets us the next step. And then Bush, and then the racism under Obama. And then in comes Trump. And Trump really doesn't have to do much at that point other than to make people feel good or comfortable going public with all of this stuff that is built up. Comes down the escalator, as he says, and talks about Mexican rapists and some I'm sure are good people. S-hole countries. Making fun of a person with a disability, all of this different stuff. And then it just explodes. So it's actually notable, and I encourage you to read the piece by James Rosen in the Hartford Courant. It's actually notable when you look at it, how little Trump had to do with the radicalization itself, but how perfectly timed he was to just drop in and coalesce it. Now, the Republican Party, remember, didn't want Trump at the beginning. They wanted the radicalization, but they wanted it to happen with someone that's more polished, like a Mitt Romney. Remember the evangelical grifters who in 2012 were saying Romney's the chosen guy. Some of them ended up like Mike Lindell from MyPillow believe Trump is the chosen by God guy. So the Republicans did want this type of radicalization. They believe it's good for fundraising. They believe it's good electorally, but they wanted it with someone more polished like a Mitt Romney. We kind of forget about that because Romney lost and Trump won. And early on, the Republican Party didn't want Trump. Eventually, he was able to commandeer the party. He said a lot of the quiet parts that were sort of quiet under Obama, although increasingly less so, out loud. And the establishment people early thought Trump was destructive to the party. Trump was bad to the party. But they eventually got, they acquiesced. Now, they were right that it was bad because ultimately the Republicans lost the House in 2018 and the Senate in 2020 and the White House in 2020. But the main takeaway is that Republicans embraced extremism well before Donald Trump. There is a very notable double standard that is taking place, as we predicted, between the Donald Trump sexual assault allegations and what's going on with Andrew Cuomo. Now, I want to remind everybody, I don't care about political party. When it was Anthony Weiner, I said, look at what this guy's accused of terrible things. I have nothing to say in defense of him. It's a shame in that he had some good political ideas, but how am I going to defend this guy? With Al Franken, I thought the resignation happened too soon. In retrospect, it definitely happened too soon, and it happened too soon in part because Democrats too quickly started saying he should resign. What Al Franken, the crass joke Al Franken was involved in was not good, but compared to the things that we've seen since with Trump and others, it seems relatively milquetoast without dismissing anyone's experience of what happened with Al Franken. But I had no interest. I don't care about party. And much like with the Andrew Cuomo thing, it's the same thing. People have been writing saying, David, why won't you cover the Andrew Cuomo scandals? I've covered every aspect of it. I've covered the nursing home piece. I've covered the sexual assault piece. I've covered every single aspect of it. And I don't care that he's a Democrat. Let the cards fall where they may. I am not impressed with politicians in terms of personality, cult of personality and deifying. What I don't care about Andrew Cuomo. If he did stuff wrong, then there should be consequences. But it is incredibly brazen to now see so many on the right, including Don Jr. himself, who's appearing on nighttime right-wing media several times a week to talk about accusers of Andrew Cuomo. These same people, including, of course, Don Jr., were saying nothing when Trump was accused by a dozen women and then a second dozen. And then what's the total number? 40, 46, 48, 50 women or something like that. Max Boot, who is not someone who I go to for political analysis, actually has a pretty good piece about this in the Washington Post called "The Andrew Cuomo Scandal Highlights Republicans' Appalling Double Standard." And he points out that the calls for Andrew Cuomo to resign from people who said nothing about the allegations against Donald Trump or said that they were not credible and shouldn't be believed and they should be ignored is crazy. And again, Max Boot points out, Democrats aren't giving Andrew Cuomo a free pass. The New York Times was integral in unveiling the sexual harassment scandal related to Andrew Cuomo. This is the New York Times that Trump and other Republicans have been saying for years is some kind of far left protector of all Democrats. And you again see the huge double standard. It's a double standard I've been pointing out for a long time. What Democrats were defending Anthony Weiner? What Democrats were, if anything, the criticism of Democrats is in order to show how they are going to go after whoever is accused very quickly. Sometimes they go too far, and arguably things went too far in the early calls for Al Franken's resignation, which took place. Now, I know a lot of people are going to write in and say, what about Tara Reade, the woman who accused Joe Biden? That received a ton of coverage, and it started to fall apart. And eventually, the story went away. I know that there are people who are not going to like that characterization and are going to say, no, it went away because it was suppressed. That's not what I believe took place at all. I think it got plenty of coverage, in fact. So I say investigate everyone, get whoever out. I don't care about political party. But what we are continuing to see is exactly the type of hypocrisy on this issue. You know, that we've seen from the right for a long time. You could argue it goes all the way back to Bill Clinton. You could argue it goes back even further than that. I mean, listen, we were talking about Newt Gingrich earlier. Newt Gingrich's past when it comes to relationships is not exactly what the evangelical right claims that they support or want to get behind. So this has decades of history behind it, and the hypocrisy is stunning. Let me know what you think. If I'm missing something in this, where I am seeing hypocrisy where there is none, or whatever, I certainly want to hear from you. Remember that Friday, March 26th, we are doing a massive one-day membership special. I'm almost getting emotional. Actually, I just kind of choked, but it plays well. February was a disastrous month for us as far as memberships go. The continued economic pressure of the virus combined with a short month leading to many cancellations and few subscriptions. So on Friday, the 26th, we are doing a massive membership discount to try to get 2021 going, for lack of a better term. If you want to be notified about that membership special, just get on my mailing list at davidpakman.com, and Friday, the 26th in the morning, you will get a perfect email telling you exactly what to do to avail yourself of this membership discount.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I recently mentioned our partnership with the YouTube channel Nerds for Humanity, and the team behind that channel has built a new website called Of the People, which you can find at ofthepeople.us, and they're one of our sponsors today. Fascinating website, basically like a Yelp for local political candidates. You can browse and search for candidates based on policy, location, and background. The key insight from Of the People is that all national politics starts local, and by making it easier to discover and support everyday folks running for city council or state assembly, county commissioner in your community, you can help incubate the talent that will become future congressional representatives, senators, even presidents. If you're a candidate running for local office, set up a profile on OTP. It's free, and you can attract exposure and donors. And everyone else, go support this grassroots platform. I put a link underneath this video. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe to the Nerds for Humanity YouTube channel.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Our program is mostly funded by memberships. You can get one at joinpakman.com. I have some delightful video for you today. Congresswoman Katie Porter has really become very, very good at humiliating people who seem to think she's clueless, people who go in to testify before Congress and apparently think that they're going to be able to get one over on her when they are not, because she's not only extremely knowledgeable on all issues financial and business, but extraordinarily well prepared. And there was a subcommittee hearing yesterday called Modernizing Energy Development Laws for the Benefit of Taxpayers, Communities, and the Environment. It's a mouthful. One of the people who was testifying was Mark Murphy, the president of the Strata Production Company in Roswell, New Mexico. This is an oil and gas company. It's not a huge company. They have 16 employees and generate, according to a report, about $2.5 million in sales. So it's not a massive company, but not particularly relevant today. And in an exchange with Katie Porter, Murphy tries to claim there's no special tax rules for oil and gas. If we have expenses, we get to deduct expenses like any other business, trying to suggest there aren't special rules that apply to oil and gas that don't apply to a mom and pop hardware store or a taco stand or whatever the case may be. It's not true. And Katie Porter knew it, and she wasn't going to let it slip. Take a look.
They're estimated to be between 60 to 90% of the cost of drilling. How much of those intangible drilling costs do you get to deduct right away from your taxes?
We get to deduct all of those just like any other business. We do not.
How much do you get to deduct?
There seems to be a misconception out there that you're operating from, that somehow the oil and gas industry benefits from some special sort of tax structure. We don't. We actually.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Murphy.
Other industries, right?
I will follow up with you, Mr. Murphy, but you do benefit from special rules. There's a special tax rule for intangible drilling costs that does not apply to other kinds of expenses that businesses have. You get to deduct 70% of your costs immediately, and other businesses have to amortize their expenses over their entire profit stream.
We also
so please don't patronize me by telling me that the oil and gas industry doesn't have any special tax provisions. Because if you would like that to be the rule, I would be happy to have Congress deliver. I yield back.
So it actually goes way beyond just this. The truth is that there are many tax benefits available for oil and gas investors that aren't available elsewhere in the tax code for other types of businesses. And some of them are sort of relatively not so much esoteric, but because they only apply to a very narrow scope of business, a lot of people aren't aware of them. The two largest subsidies for oil and gas are something called excess of percentage over cost depletion and the expensing of exploration and development costs. These add up to billions in subsidies for companies like Mark Murphy's. And when we talk about excess of percentage over cost depletion, what this allows producers, harvesters of oil and gas to do is deduct a fixed percentage of gross revenue as a capital expense each year, regardless of whether they actually had that capital expense or not. So when the way that you would typically deduct costs is you deduct real costs. You have, $1 million in revenue and $100,000 in costs, and you deduct the $100,000 in real costs. This special rule for oil and gas allows producers like Mark Murphy's company to deduct 15% of gross revenue for what's called resource depletion, regardless of whether they actually incurred that as an amount of cost. You just chop 15% right off the top. You made 10 million, you get to deduct 1.5 million, 15%, because you are depleting your source of oil and gas. You get a benefit from the very depletion of a resource which you are executing. What? That is a specific benefit for oil and gas. Intangible drilling costs, which include everything but actual drilling equipment. So when you do drilling, there's labor, there's chemicals, there's grease, there's all sorts of other stuff that are considered intangible. These expenses normally are 60 to 80% of the total cost of drilling a well, and they are 100% deductible in the year incurred. So if it costs $300,000 to drill a well, and we say, well, of that 300,000, 75% is intangible, the investor gets a deduction right away of the full amount, even if you don't produce oil, even if you don't strike oil, as long as you started to operate that facility by the 31st of March of the following year, you get to deduct all this stuff regardless of what's actually happening. Most businesses don't get to do that. Oil and gas also get accelerated depreciation of infrastructure. And they also get an exemption on alternative minimum tax. And I know we're getting sort of like wonky and deep here. There's something called alternative minimum tax. The point of alternative minimum tax is to avoid people from being able to deduct all the way down to owing nothing. So at higher incomes, imagine you make $5 million. You might be able to, by combining accelerated depreciation, intangible deductions, all this different stuff, you might be able to say, hey, you know what? I have an adjusted income of only $1 million. Even though there was a $5 million that came in, I've got all these different deductions. I get down to $1 million. The point of alternative minimum tax is to say you can't deduct yourself below a certain level of taxable income. The tax law specifically exempts those intangible drilling costs from alternative minimum tax. So regardless of your AMT, you can always continue to deduct out those intangible drilling costs. That's a gift to oil and gas. So nice job by Katie Porter pointing out that there are special exceptions made for oil and gas that don't apply to other businesses. And I could go on with even more of these. There are actually a ton of them. And the whole point, the oil and gas industry doesn't want you to know about these, because if you did, you might be outraged, as you should be. Something really strange is happening at White House press briefings lately. It's almost like reporters don't have any idea what to ask about. And I don't want to suggest that there is nothing to ask about. As I've talked about for weeks now, Joe Biden's failed executive order on stopping deportations, foreign policy questions, minimum wage. There are plenty of things to ask about during Jen Psaki's White House press briefings. But for some reason, reporters at press briefings are increasingly concerned with asking over and over and over again, why won't you call the situation at the border a crisis, which is just this endlessly semantic question. And yesterday, questions about Joe Biden's dogs and possibly a cat. I'm not joking. Joe Biden's younger dog, Major Biden, bit someone at the White House. The person is fine. As of yesterday, it wasn't totally clear who it was. As of today, it seems that it was a Secret Service agent. It was reported that Major Biden was sort of surprised as a Secret Service agent came around the corner or something like that, had a minor injury, treated at the White House. Now, after one reporter had already asked about it yesterday, another reporter asks a follow-up, and the question is phrased in a wacky, histrionic, dramatic way, asking whether Jen Psaki can assure the American public that Major Biden isn't going to be euthanized. Look at this.
About three things, if that's okay. The dogs, immigration, and then Governor Cuomo.
Another dogs question. Okay, go ahead.
I'd like to follow just a quick clarification
Sure.
on the dogs.
Okay.
Can you confirm that it was a Secret Service member who was bitten, and can you also reassure the public that Major Biden will not be euthanized as a result of this?
Well, certainly Major Biden is a member of the family, so I can assure you that. I don't have any more details on the individual. I would encourage you to ask the Secret Service, but I'm not going to have any more details other than that.
It's all phrased in the most histrionic and dramatic terms possible. Jen, can you assure the public, as if the public is waiting around to know this, that Major won't be euthanized? If you have to ask a second question about Joe Biden's dogs, maybe it would be, has the Biden family determined how they will handle Major Biden in the future in light of this dog bite? Like if you are going to insist on asking more about it, but can you reassure us he won't be euthanized? Just desperate to create controversy. If she had said, I have no idea whether they're going to euthanize the dog, I haven't spoken to Joe Biden about it, then the headline would be, Jen Psaki refuses to deny that that Major Biden might be euthanized. And then I guess at some point, someone in the past said maybe the Bidens will be getting a cat. And another reporter asking about the cat, if you can imagine.
questions. We've heard a lot about dogs. We were promised a White House cat. What happened to that?
Where is the cat? Today's a good day for the cat. I don't have any update on the cat. We know the cat will break the internet, but I don't have any update on its status.
So there it is, literally devolving into questions about dogs and cats. And I think part of what's going on here, part is the reporters don't know what to ask about substantively. Part of it is that we are now moving beyond the reality TV presidency of Donald Trump. Joe Biden isn't tweeting attacks at people all day long. Joe Biden's administration isn't denouncing the press as an institution. And it's sort of like reporters are struggling to move beyond the reality show that was the Trump presidency. My question to you is, do you think they don't know what to ask, or do they think that these questions will be seen as relevant and interesting by the American people? I just don't even understand the motivation to ask about a cat. Maybe don't ask a question if you have nothing relevant to ask about. Maybe that's part of it, where if you're in the briefing room, even if you have nothing to say, you want to get a question in there. And so you ask about a cat. I really don't have the explanation as to what's going on, but I'd be curious to hear from you. And we'll have more on this on the David Pakman Show Instagram page. Find us on Instagram at David Pakman Show. Find me on Instagram at david.pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The number one funding source for the David Pakman Show has been and continues to be membership. And membership is not just a feel-good thing. You get access to the world-famous bonus show every single day just for members, as well as commercial-free audio and video feeds of the show day in and day out. You can sign up for membership very, very quickly at joinpakman.com. That's joinpakman.com. If the normal prices strike you as high, by all means, use the coupon code BETTER21, all one word, all lowercase. Become a member today.
Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Today, I'm going to be speaking with Naomi Klein, who is senior correspondent at The Intercept and also author of How to Change Everything. Naomi, great to have you on today.
Happy to be with you.
I've been engaging in this conversation with many in my audience about how we sort of make progress on a lot of different issues that come down to what people know and what people believe. Certainly climate change would be on that list. At a more micro level, you know, even beliefs about what happened in the November of 2020 election would count. Beliefs about how vaccines work, beliefs about the messages we get from the CDC and others. And I believe that there's really no simple fix here. I think that this is probably a multi-generational project. Folks have been sort of indoctrinated into many of the orthodoxies that now plague us, starting, I would argue, going back to the Reagan era, with stories of welfare queens and so on and so forth. I'm curious as to the reason for sort of writing this book to be accessible to younger readers. Is it at least partially an acknowledgement of the battle we're up against here that will be quite a long battle?
That's an interesting question. You know, I didn't think about it in that way of like, get them while they're young. I really wrote the book directed at young readers, because this book it's my first book that is for young readers. It's really geared towards like middle school and early high school. And it's really because this is where the energy of the climate movement is right now. You know, I was on the board of 350.org for a decade and was part of kicking off the fossil fuel divestment movement, which was very much university age students. And those, you know, university age students are still involved in all kinds of activism, as you know, but the energy of the climate movement is now coming from younger than that. It's like Greta, it's the Greta generation. And so that's why I wanted to write a book for this kind of, I see a real generational shift, and I wanted to arm those young people with the facts and figures to to make them better activists and to keep them in the struggle for the long term.
Yeah, you seem to go at what are frequent misconceptions among adults. I mean, I think what's interesting is that the issues you're addressing aren't particularly different because the audience is younger. It's just eventually folks with misunderstandings get older and then they become adults with a lot of the same misunderstandings. As an example, you go at this idea of climate change isn't just it's warmer everywhere all the time. We're talking about there could be a warming over all of the oceans with erratically hot and cold weather the way we've seen in Texas and in other places. The issues seem to be quite similar, as if you were addressing an adult audience.
Yeah, look, the information in this book is not substantively different than the information in books I've written for older readers. It's not dumbed down. It's just kind of simplified. And a lot of people have told me that they think that the book would be actually suitable for adults that they know, which may well be true. And I'm not going to comment on that. I mean, because we didn't dumb it down. We just kind of pared it down, simplified it. And the fact is, the first book I wrote about climate change, This Changes Everything, has 70 pages of endnotes. I mean, it's really like, it's just very backed up, and it's really about bringing the receipts and proving and reproving, because when that book was published in 2014, making the argument that it's sort of the core drivers of capitalism and the neoliberal project that are at the root of why we failed to address this crisis was treated as a really, really radical idea. And so I really needed to back it up. But I think that having a more sort of simplified handbook can be helpful for people of all ages. But one point I would want to make about what you were just bringing up at the start around, around this multi-generational project, I would say that there's some really interesting research that shows that the most effective communicators at changing minds are the daughters of climate change deniers, that or people who believe that, okay, it's real, but there's nothing that we can do. Rather than hearing, somebody on television lecture them, what the research finds actually is that parents are being swayed by their kids. Their kids are pushing them around the dinner table and saying, what are you doing about this? I'm really frightened. I want something different. So it turns out that when we reach kids, we actually do reach their parents.
We've all seen stories of a lifelong, typically Republican elected official who had homophobic beliefs for a long time, and then it turns out that they have an LGBT child in their family or nephew or something like that, and they ultimately revisit their beliefs and they come out with a different view, and that's sort of good at the maybe what we would call the retail level. But depending on everyone having like a personal experience could be difficult if that's what we're counting on. I'm wondering how this would apply to climate change, where to some degree, does the cultural shift need the repercussions to be more real and tangible to individuals before they may be fully willing to consider they may have been led astray on this issue?
Well, the first thing I would just say is that people are already experiencing the impacts of climate change.
Yes.
And this is very, very widespread. And so I think it's important to clearly explain how something like what just happened in Texas may well be linked with a warming, destabilized climate. Certainly the wildfires that people are living with every summer in the Pacific Northwest is definitely linked to climate change. Certainly more ferocious summer storms are linked to warming oceans.
Right.
So we need to be making those arguments. And it isn't like, I just want to be clear that it's not like, oh, we have to wait till things get really bad and then people will understand this is real. Things are bad. Things are really bad. And we need to make those arguments. We need to make those connections.
And in terms of, I guess your thoughts about the cultural change that because with a lot of these things, as we know, it's not about hammering facts necessarily.
So I guess the other thing I I would just emphasize, and this is just my perspective, I feel like some of your questions are coming from, are emphasizing what I would describe as the hard deniers, right? The
Yes.
kind of like the hardest to reach kind of Fox News addicted, it's all a Chinese hoax, like really, really dug in
Right.
climate change deniers. And I actually don't spend a ton of time thinking about how to reach the hardest to reach. I think that there's more productive work to be done in what's sometimes described as the soft climate deniers, or people who actually don't deny the reality of climate change at all, believe it is happening, but what they believe is that we're too far gone. It's human nature. We're never going to really think about the future. Kind of climate doomers more than climate deniers. And I think we actually make a mistake by overemphasizing reaching the hardest to reach, most dug in, most invested in that denial mindset, while ignoring a much easier to reach middle terrain of people who know it's happening, but feel kind of hopeless about doing anything about it, right?
That's interesting.
Yeah, and
If we do a good job, if we do a good job of reaching the soft deniers, do the hard deniers even matter as much?
They matter much, much less, because in fact, what the polling shows is that a majority of Americans know that climate change is happening. A lot of people think it's too late. A lot of people have bought the idea that you have to choose between good jobs and acting on climate. So there's a ton of work to be done, working with trade unions, organizing workers in different sectors, and really designing a future that people are willing to fight for. Right? That's what a Green New Deal is about. And breaking that sort of false dichotomy between choosing between jobs and caring about the environment. That I think is very productive.
How do you suggest approaching those who maybe are in that middle group where they acknowledge that it's happening? They probably even acknowledge that at least some part of it is because of human activity, if not all, but they don't like what they believe to be the solutions, which might in their minds include, we might not be able to have cars anymore. We'd be restricted on travel. We might have to keep our houses at 55 degrees in that they don't like what they believe the lifestyle implications are.
Right. And they believe that because they've been lied to.
Right.
And they believe that because there's been a very systematic campaign to, latch onto a throwaway joke that AOC made about banning cow farts to claim that they're going to come seize the cattle, and ban airlines forever, things like that.
Yeah.
That's been a deliberate campaign to scare people. And so, I think a lot of these arguments are not going to be won with arguments. They're going to be won with facts. They're going to be won with people's lived experiences. And this is where I think that it's useful to think about some of FDR's strategies in rolling out the original New Deal, right? The Green New Deal is modeled after, and it's not an imitation. It's also a corrective in lots of ways and problems with the original New Deal, but it's inspired by the original New Deal in the scale, in the mobilization, in the idea that we need a mission, right? The original New Deal was not a narrow poverty alleviation program in the middle of the Great Depression. It was a new governing framework that affected every aspect of life, right? It was dozens and dozens of policies. And that's the kind of ambition that we need in the face of a crisis that touches every part of our lives, right? The reason we get overwhelmed in the face of the climate crisis is because we know that it isn't going to be solved by, changing our light bulbs like we were told for a couple of decades, right? I mean, it affects every aspect of our lives. And we've never had a policy framework on the scale of the crisis that we face. So coming back to FDR, he was very smart in where he cited New Deal projects. Like if you map where FDR planted CCC projects, for instance, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is responsible for around 800 state parks, planted more than 2 billion trees, employed around 3 million young people. he deliberately cited those CCC camps in the parts of the country that voted against him. And if you look at the election results in 1936, he flipped many of those red rural areas blue. And they didn't do it with arguments. They did it with, facts on the ground. They did it with this is services that are improving your community, improving daily life, creating jobs, and people saw it. And they liked it and they wanted more. And so I think that this should be a challenge for the Democrats. They have lost rural America, and we can't write off rural America. We need to invest, and it isn't going to be about having the perfect argument and the perfect messaging. It's going to be about what is this huge green infrastructure program going to look like? Who's going to benefit from it? How is that going to be messaged once it's being rolled out? And that is way more important than some abstract debate that we could have about, no, it's not going to kill jobs. No, show people the jobs, change people's daily lives for the better.
Yeah, along those lines, I mean, I'd love to kind of wrap our conversation talking legislatively. We know Joe Biden does not support the Green New Deal, but took many elements from it in putting together what his proposal was before he was elected. And of course, we will now see if after this COVID relief bill is done, whether that is very high on the list of priorities and sort of what happens. Do you think that if it doesn't happen during these 2 years during which Democrats know they control the House, Senate, and White House, that it really becomes a question mark as to if and when it happens? I mean, do you think it's urgent that it be done, not just from the scientific standpoint, where obviously it's urgent, but politically as well?
Yeah, it's urgent on both fronts.
Right.
That this is our window. We are now in what we call the decade of the Green New Deal.
Right.
And frankly, I don't really care about the branding of it. You want to call it Build Back Better. I don't care. What matters is that it's guided by science and justice. Right. And as long as those core principles are there, that we are staying within our carbon budget of keeping temperature warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, doing everything we possibly can, and I don't care what you call it. If 40% of the green infrastructure is actually going to be for frontline communities of color based on core environmental justice principles, I don't care what you call it, right? Because you're taking the core ideas behind the Green New Deal and behind the just transition. I mean, the truth is these ideas have gone by many names over the years. When I wrote This Changes Everything, I started it with a quote from a Bolivian climate change negotiator who called for a Marshall Plan for planet Earth. That's what they called it in 2009. We've called it the LEAP in Canada. I don't care what you call it. I care what we do. And we have 2 years. You're absolutely right. We have 2 years to convince people with their lived experience, not convince people on television, convince people with their lived experience and communicating the ideas and the reality behind these policies, because we just can't lose any more time. We have lost decades talking and not acting. Yep. Scientifically, environmentally, and politically urgent. I think we would certainly agree. The book is How to Change Everything. And Naomi Klein, the book's author, is senior correspondent for The Intercept. So great having you on today. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Take care. Bye, David.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show is audience-supported media, and you can contribute any amount you want on Patreon, as little as $1 per month. Plus, you can get the daily bonus show, world famous at this point, and the daily commercial-free TV show by making those pledges at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. This is audience-supported media. We depend on the support of our viewers and listeners. Whether you listen to the podcast, watch on YouTube, or watch us on TV, or even listen on the radio, patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
One of the oldest, most tired, and unsophisticated tropes of the American right wing is calling anything nuanced, anything intellectual, even simply something science-based, gay, or sometimes they'll use the code word effeminate if they're a little slicker like Fox News propagandist Tucker Carlson. And indeed, last night, Tucker Carlson did a commentary about this entire pandemic. And it was sort of a rant about how all these doctors and experts telling us what to do aren't the people that we should be following, and that there's something sort of not masculine, in fact, about following people like Dr. Fauci. And Tucker devolves into the basest of base arguments, which is that listening to public health experts like Dr. Fauci makes one delicate, timid, and effeminate, which are just sophisticated words for the right wing to say, oh, that's gay, man. That's really gay. And of course, Tucker hides this by saying this is the view of some Chinese advisor to the government. Why Tucker cares what a Chinese advisor would say when typically Tucker is denouncing the Chinese Communist Party, I don't know. But here it's convenient. And Tucker says, look, the advisor says that it's a masculinity crisis. It's effeminate to do this stuff. And it's sort of like when we listen to Dr. Fauci. Take a listen to this.
Well, this tells you everything. In March of last year, the leadership of the United States and of China both declared national emergencies. In the U.S., Tony Fauci warned Congress that reopening American businesses could cause, quote, coronavirus outbreaks the government may not be able to control. Going outside, Tony Fauci said, was just too risky. Meanwhile, in China, where the coronavirus originated, a top advisor to the Chinese government declared that the country was experiencing a very different kind of threat, a more profound threat. The problem, he said, was a national masculinity crisis. Chinese boys, quote, have been spoiled by housewives and female teachers, and they were becoming, as a result, quote, delicate, timid, and effeminate. In essence, they were becoming people who might listen to someone like Tony Fauci. Left unchecked, said the Chinese government advisor, the feminization of Chinese boys would, quote, inevitably endanger the survival and development of the Chinese nation.
Did you see how Tucker did that? He doesn't use the word gay, and he doesn't say it's his idea, but then he says it's sort of like listening to Dr. Fauci, the Chinese doctor saying we've become delicate, timid, and effeminate. That's sort of like when we listen to Dr. Fauci, when Dr. Fauci as a doctor explains how viruses work and suggests what people should do. If you listen to that, it's sort of gay. That's the code language that is being used here. This is just red meat for the right. It's another version of the real men don't go to the doctor type of sort of troglodytic thinking. Now, maybe natural selection prefers effeminate, timid, and delicate. I don't know. I guess we'll see who survives this thing. But they're not even trying to hide their contempt and resentment for anybody who listens to actual experts rather than Fox News so-called experts. Now, you really have to think about what the end game is here, because it strikes me as illogical. And what I mean by that is Fox News's audience is disproportionately older folks who we know are more at risk of dying from coronavirus. If Fox News's audience followed the advice of Fox News hosts for the last year, many of them would be dying when they didn't have to die. Fox News would be essentially killing off its own audience. And it makes no sense in that context. So the end game can't possibly be that. But it's all part of the political movement that pushed the anti-mask protests for freedom, promoted Donald Trump's radiologist Dr. Scott Atlas's views on a communicable disease completely outside of his area of expertise, generally promoted ignoring science on just about every aspect of the pandemic. And it's amazing how much things change and yet how much things stay the same. So much has changed in society and culture since when I was in school in the 90s, and it was common to say, oh, that's gay. And yet Tucker Carlson, a 51-year-old man in 2021, is going right back to that same trope. Now, one last thought, just as an aside, is Tucker Carlson now the image of right-wing masculinity? And I ask that in a serious way. I don't care how Tucker looks. I care about what Tucker says. But is it now, is this the image that Republicans now consider the pinnacle of masculinity? A bow tie wearing, sort of high pitched voice, country club guy? Maybe it is. I don't know. And I don't care what Tucker looks like or what he sounds like. I care about what he says. But it's also kind of weird to me that he's talking about it's effeminate to listen to doctors when I don't recognize Tucker as the image of right-wing masculinity that's sort of bandied about at the motorcycle rallies and the shooting ranges. I don't know. Now, just one more thing. Tucker in the opening also said going outside is too risky, according to Dr. Fauci. I looked and looked and couldn't find any instances throughout this pandemic of Dr. Fauci saying, stay in your homes. I just couldn't find it. So it seems that also, even on the premise, even on the facts, Tucker Carlson is not surprisingly completely wrong again. Hey, this is sort of becoming a more interesting news story to me. Now, as many of you know, we did not cover the Meghan Markle Prince Harry interview with Oprah on the podcast or on the broadcast show. We did talk about why these stories do well on yesterday's bonus show, but we didn't talk about the actual interview on the broadcast show. Just didn't really seem like a story for our show. There's now kind of like an ancillary or a tangential media story which has developed around this, which is that British journalist and TV personality Piers Morgan, who at one point actually had a nightly show in the United States, stormed off the set of Good Morning Britain yesterday and then subsequently quit or was fired. It's one of those situations where we don't know. I had no idea of the full backstory on this, and it's quite interesting in how thin-skinned Piers appears to be. Apparently, Piers Morgan has been displeased with Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, for a long time. And part of it might be that he tried to date her and she wasn't interested. Check out this video where he explains that they went on what I'm hearing described as a date, and then she ghosted him. Take a look.
Yeah. We had 2 hours in the pub. She had a couple of dirty martinis, had a couple of pints. We got on brilliantly. And then I put her in a cab, and it turned out to be a cab that took her to a party where she met Prince Harry. And then the next night they had a solo dinner together, and that was the last I ever heard from Meghan Markle. And I have never heard from her again.
So what happened?
She ghosted me, Ryan. Meghan Markle ghosted me.
Did she? Do you think she just went? Gone?
I'm afraid. Look, I really liked her. This is why it hurts. No, I really liked her.
So this almost appears to be a personal thing for Piers based on that. And this, unbeknownst to me until I learned about all of it, has led to Piers making lots of negative comments about Meghan Markle over the years. Again, I don't follow this stuff. I learned all of it in the last 24 hours. So then over the last couple of days, Piers has continued to attack Meghan, saying that her claims about British royal family being concerned about her son's skin color is completely fabricated, that the British royal family isn't racist, that Meghan Markle is lying. Piers just defending the royals and attacking Meghan Markle. Yesterday on Good Morning Britain, his co-host, Alex Beresford, essentially said, Piers, what you've been saying is disgusting. And Piers Morgan literally walks off the set. Take a look.
And I understand that you don't like Meghan Markle. You've made it so clear a number of times on this programme, a number of times. And I understand that you've got a personal relationship with Meghan Markle, or had one, and she cut you off. She's entitled to cut you off if she wants to. Has she said anything about you since she cut you off? I don't think she has, but yet you continue to trash her.
OK, I'm done with this.
No.
Sorry, no. Sorry.
Do you know what? That's pathetic.
You can trash me, maybe not my
No.
See you later.
I'm being...
Sorry, can't do this.
This is absolutely diabolical behaviour. I'm sorry, but Piers spouts off on a regular basis, and we all have to sit there and listen. 6:30 to 7 o'clock yesterday was incredibly hard to watch.
So Piers Morgan walking off there, and then subsequently after this episode yesterday, it was abruptly announced by ITV that Piers Morgan is departing Good Morning Britain. The official statement is that, quote, following discussions with ITV, Piers Morgan has decided now is the time to leave. Now, the wording doesn't tell us whether Piers Morgan decided that because he was told by ITV, you should decide that it's time to leave. We don't know. We may never know. For me, the worst part of all of this, and what makes me want to talk about it, is that Piers Morgan on Monday said he doesn't believe Meghan Markle was truly suicidal. One of the things that came up during the interview with Oprah Winfrey that was revealed by Meghan Markle was that she was having suicidal thoughts. I really don't care about the royal family. As you know, it's not something we cover other than to say that it's an antiquated apparatus and institution. My concerns are journalistic ethics, harm reduction, people's health, media ethics, and this type of thing. We are in a mental health crisis exacerbated by the pandemic, with so much stigma around seeking treatment and such lack of access to mental health treatment in the United States and in many other countries. And someone notable publicly saying, I was suicidal, I was thinking of taking my own life. And then someone as prominent as Piers Morgan says, I doubt whether that's really true. I think she might have been making it up. that's a disaster and it's dangerous and it could actually lead to more suicide. Now, I don't care about Piers. He's wealthy. He'll find other jobs. He'll be fine in all ways. But fundamentally, he's always struck me as an insecure guy. There's instances of him making fun of reality show contestants in ways that seem to kind of go beyond what would be normal just for entertainment. But this is really just beyond the pale. And it all kind of falling apart before our very eyes in the last 24 hours. And the risk is that by casting doubt onto, we know that, for example, we know that one reason that rape accusers sometimes don't come forward is fear that they won't be believed. And much the same way, Piers saying he doubts the truth of whether someone claiming to have been suicidal was really suicidal. That's only going to encourage people who need help not to seek it. And it could have disastrous consequences. So that's the most vile and disgusting aspect of this. I'm interested also in hearing from you what your thoughts are about the entire fiasco. We have a voicemail number, and that number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here is a voicemail I received from a nurse about COVID and vitamin D, an important topic. Let's take a listen.
Your bonus show dated March the 9th, and you're talking about COVID cases and the obesity, 77% those cases with severe morbid obesity. I'm a dietitian practicing in St. Louis in a critical illness recovery hospital where we specialize in.
Okay, so dietitian, not nurse. Just to correct that.
Weaning patients off of ventilators, and I do nutrition support. And one of the things that you were touching upon was vitamin D. And I have been doing investigation on my own. And every single patient that we have had been tested for vitamin D deficiency, with an alarming amount of those people having deficiency. And there was a CDC YouTube post December the 10th of 2020, I believe it was.
Right.
Talking about vitamin D and its correlation with outcomes of COVID-19 infection. And basically, if you're low status, you're more susceptible to the.
Okay, and it got cut off there, but the important word there is correlation. There's a lot being looked at with vitamin D and COVID, but I think we have to be careful about saying that supplementation of vitamin D is protective, or that once in the hospital, giving people vitamin D helps them recover. And one of the real questions is, does serious COVID deplete vitamin D? When we find the correlation, which is definitely there, a lot of the people with the most serious COVID cases have low vitamin D. We might jump to a causal relationship. It's conceivable that it's causal, but it's reversed, that one might have normal vitamin D before getting COVID, and that falling to serious COVID depletes vitamin D. That's one possibility, which is a reverse causation. It also may be a correlation without causation. We just have to be careful. It's being studied, and I want to know more about it, but I don't want to go beyond what I've read on vitamin D and COVID in peer-reviewed data. We have a great bonus show for you today. Burger King sent out a tweet that created a real problem, which is women belong in the kitchen. What they meant was they want more women chefs in the world. It sounded very, very different. Burger King having to correct the record. Alaska has opened COVID vaccination to 16 plus. It's incredible what Alaska is doing on vaccination, particularly given how rural much of Alaska is. And we will also talk about the reality of people on unemployment benefits. Many on the right believe people are living the high life on unemployment benefits, including with the enhanced unemployment provided through COVID relief. This is not the case. This is not the case. And we will talk about that and more on today's bonus show. It's actually a good bonus show today. This one may get an award, which we will give out, of course. Get instant access to the bonus show by becoming a member at joinpakman.com. Thanks a lot for watching today's show. I just want to take a second to tell you about today's sponsors. Of the People is a new platform matching local campaigns with supporters and donors from across the country. Sort of like a Yelp for local candidates. You can filter by policy and location, and you can support the next generation of leaders. Check it out at ofthepeople.us.